To Algeria International, our voice in the world.
This is the English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
Diplomacy Chief Ahmed Attaf took part in the funeral of Pope Francis held today in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. The A3+ group made of Algeria, Somalia, Sierra Leone and Guyana has called in New York for an inclusive transition in Syria, stressing that a lasting peace requires the commitment of all components of the Syrian society. The third round of negotiations on Iran's nuclear today resumed in the Yemeni capital Muscat between Iranian diplomacy chief and US envoy Steve Witkoff. Hello and welcome on Radio Algeria International. I'm Mariam Barshi. The Minister of State in charge of Foreign Affairs, the National Community Abroad and African Affairs, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, took part in the funeral of Pope Francis held today in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. The Minister of State reiterated that to the Vatican representatives the condolences of the President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune, following the death of Pope Francis, whom he praised for his dedication to the values of fraternity, mutual aid and coexistence between peoples, and for his commitment to the poor and oppressed throughout the world. Mr. Attaf's participation in the funeral demonstrates the strong ties existing between Algeria and the Vatican. The funeral took place in the presence of a large crowd and was marked by the participation of several leaders, representatives of state, and heads of international governmental organizations and royalty. The Vatican estimated that more than 250,000 people attended the ceremony, which lasted for 2 hours. Pope Francis, the first non-European pope for almost 13 centuries, battled to reshape the Roman Catholic Church, siding with the poor and marginalized, while challenging wealthy nations to help migrants and reverse climate change. A memorandum of understanding has been signed in Istanbul between the Algerian Constitutional Court and its Turkish counterpart to strengthen cooperation and exchanges between the two judicial bodies. Signed on the occasion of the participation of the head of the Constitutional Court, Mr. Omar Belhaj, in the celebration marking the 63rd anniversary of the creation of the Turkish Constitutional Court. The Memorandum of Understanding aims to strengthen cooperation, the exchange of information and expertise, and institutional capacity building based on the best practice in the field of constitutional law and justice. In this connection, the head of the Constitutional Court, Omar Belhaj, held the good relations between the Turkish and Algerian courts on the bilateral regional and international plans. These, he went on to say, are highlighted through the two courts' participation, notably in the World Conference on the Constitutional Justice, the Conference of the African Constitutional Jurisdiction, as well as the Conference of the Constitutional Jurisdiction of the Member States of the Islamic Cooperation Organization. Evoking his participation in April 2022 in the ceremonies marking the creation of Turkish Constitutional Court, he had the following.
It was an honor for me to take part in April 2022 in the ceremonies marking the 16th anniversary of the creation of the Turkish Constitutional Court. It offered me the opportunity in my capacity as the first president of the Algerian Constitutional Court to expound the main constitutional reforms undertaken by the President of the Republic and which were endorsed by the Algerian people as part of a referendum held on November 1st, 2020. Among these, the creation of the Constitutional Court, which endowed with large and unprecedented prerogatives as ever in our country.
That was the head of the Algerian Constitutional Court, Omar Belhaj. The A3+ group of the Security Council, made of Algeria, Somalia, Sierra Leone and Guyana, has called in New York for an inclusive transition in Syria, stressing that a lasting peace requires the commitment of all components of the Syrian society. Speaking on behalf of the A3+ group, the Algerian ambassador Amr Benjameh stressed the need to involve all stakeholders in Syria's political process and held the ongoing dialogue between Syrian authorities and various segments of the Syrian society.
Syria stands at a pivotal moment in its history. Having endured profound hardship, its people now look to the future with hope and cautious optimism. This hope must be nurtured through sustained international support and cooperation. They envision a brighter Syria, built by and for all Syrians, where no one is marginalized. The A3 Plus firmly believes that a successful and inclusive transition must be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, with the strong backing of the international community.
Mr. Benjama called for the full respect of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He stressed the need for the immediate and complete withdrawal of Israeli occupying forces from Syrian territory under their control.
The A3 Plus remains seriously concerned about Israel's repeated attacks and violations of Syria's sovereignty. The A3 Plus strongly condemns this military operation that violate international law, including the United Nations charters, and we call for full compliance with the 1974 disengagement agreement. Moreover, we urge an immediate end to Israeli incursions into Syrian territories and a complete withdrawal of its forces. The Golan Heights remains Syrian under international law.
The A3 Plus group held a recent announcement of a new transitional government by the interim authorities and looks forward to the next steps that will help ensure an inclusive political process. Mr. Benjama stressed that the lasting peace requires the commitment of all components of the Syrian society. Inclusion is not only desirable, it is essential for sustainable coexistence and national reconciliation. This includes the empowerment of women, youth and communities. The A3 Plus group also praised the ongoing dialogue between the interim authorities and the various Syrian communities, highlighting that the disagreements can and must be resolved through dialogue and reconciliation, not confrontation. The United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, for his part called for greater support for a political transition in the country. He stressed that the situation in Syria remains fragile, while major challenges still facing the political process despite the recent developments on the ground. He added that despite Syria's new expanded and more diverse cabinet, it is still not a fully inclusive framework for a political transition.
That political transition is now at a critical juncture. The legal vacuum that existed before the Constitutional Declaration was issued has been partly filled by it. Syria has moved beyond a caretaker government to a new, expanded and more diverse cabinet. This is indeed an improvement from what went before. Yet it is still not fully inclusive framework for a political transition.
That was the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen. Moving into the situation in the Middle East, at least 17 Palestinians were killed in new bombardments carried out today by the Israeli army against various areas of the Gaza Strip. Local sources said about 20 people were reported missing following the most violent attack that was launched against the district of the town of Gaza. This brought to 56 the number of Palestinians killed over the past 24 hours in the Israeli attacks, during which scores of Palestinians have been wounded. In this respect, the head of UNRWA, Philip Lazzarini, denounced the restrictions imposed last month by the Israeli occupying authorities on the entry of aid into Gaza, rejecting, as he put it, a famine caused by men and politically motivated. The third round of indirect negotiations on Iran's nuclear today resumed in the Omani capital Muscat between Iranian diplomacy chief and US envoy Steve Witkoff. The indirect negotiations, which are due to last one day, came in the wake of similar meetings held this month in Muscat and in Rome respectively. However, the Iranian authorities did not rule out the idea of extending the negotiations if necessary. Experts would be holding technical discussions beside the high-level negotiations held under the mediation of the Omani foreign minister. The US-Iranian negotiations are the first of the like since the US withdrew from the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran's nuclear program in 2018. The agreement signed in 2015 was aimed at monitoring Iran's nuclear activities in return for a lifting of sanctions. Iran has offered to mediate between India and Pakistan after a military escalation following a deadly attack in Kashmir that New Delhi blames on Islamabad. Iran said it was ready to step up its efforts to help ease tensions and resolve the crisis. The Pakistani Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, stressed that his country was ready to protect every square inch of its soil after a second exchange of shots in Kashmir with neighboring India. Speaking at a military ceremony, Shehbaz Sharif reiterated that accusing his country of being linked to the death of 26 civilians in the Himalayan foothills of disputed Kashmir on Tuesday was unfounded. The head of the Pakistani government has even called for a neutral inquiry into the attack, of which is accused by its Indian neighbour. India, for its part, is still conducting a manhunt in Kashmir, saying it is looking for 2 Pakistani gunmen. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC and Rwanda have signed a declaration of principles in Washington aimed at restoring peace in the east of the DRC. The 2 countries reaffirmed their mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, their will to resolve dispute by peaceful means, encourage the voluntary and safe return of displaced people, and to establish a framework for regional economic integration. The declaration stressed that the DRC and Rwanda have agreed to create a preliminary draft peace agreement by May 2nd. Let's recall that on January 2026, the Congolese Ministry of Foreign Affairs called back its diplomat in Kigali and demanded that Rwanda put an end to all its diplomatic and consular activities on Congolese soil. The east of the DRC, rich in mineral resources, remains a source of tension with several armed groups seeking to control resources such as coltan, tin, tantalum and gold. According to the United Nations, around 1 million people, including 400,000 children, have been newly displaced since the end of January. The number could rise further as hostilities continue in the provinces of North and South Kivu. Earlier, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, has warned that the worsening funding crisis is threatening critical aid to Congolese refugees arriving in Burundi and straining relations between refugees and host communities. The UNHCR said the recent influx of refugees fleeing conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, had led to the first new refugee emergency in the current global humanitarian funding crisis, and the consequences are already very serious. The UNHCR Director for Emergencies, Ayaki Ito, who has just returned from Burundi, warned at the regular UN press briefing in Geneva that without sufficient support, refugees are being forced to make difficult decisions in order to survive, pointing out that Congolese refugees are being forced to travel back and forth between the DRC and Burundi in search for help and safety. This warning from the United Nations Refugee Agency comes as more than 70,000 people have entered Burundi since January, fleeing the ongoing violence in the east of neighboring DRC. Since then, more than 12,000 people have been relocated to Musenyi refugee site in eastern Burundi. According to the UNHCR, the Musenyi site, designed to accommodate 3,000 refugees, is now home to some 16,000 living conditions that are becoming unbearable. In Iran, at least 4 people were killed and over 500 others wounded in an explosion that occurred today in a major port in the country's southern part. According to the state television, rescue operations are underway to try and find any survivors, although the death toll is still provisional. And with this last piece of news, now a recall of today's top stories. Diplomacy Chief Ahmed Hattaf took part in the funeral of Pope Francis held today in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. The A3+ group made of Algeria, Somalia, Sierra Leone and Guyana has called in New York for an inclusive transition in Syria, stressing that a lasting peace requires the commitment of all components of the Syrian society. The third round of the negotiation on Iran's nuclear today resumed in the Omani capital, Muscat, between Iranian diplomacy chief and US envoy Steve Witkoff. Stay tuned on Radio Algeria International.